In a worn-out garage on the edge of Denver, Elijah Monroe quietly wiped his hands on an oil-stained cloth and listened in silence as Alexandra Holt, the most powerful CEO in the American luxury car industry, declared in front of his entire crew, "You could never build a supercar." She did not know that the Apex Spectre X parked just outside the door, the $20 million machine she called the greatest car she had ever owned, had been designed by that very same man, every curve calculated, every millimeter of aerodynamics engineered, every detail born from 4 years of his life. Who was the mechanic standing in that garage? Stay with this, the truth behind his silence will leave you speechless. Monroe Custom Works opened its doors at 7 in the morning, 6 days a week, without exception. The sign above the entrance was faded at the edges, the paint on the exterior wall had begun to peel in the Colorado sun, and the parking lot held more oil stains than it did cars at any given hour before noon. Elijah Monroe was already underneath a Porsche 911 GT3 when the rest of Denver was still deciding whether to hit snooze a second time, lying on his back on the concrete floor with his eyes half closed, listening to the engine the way a doctor listens through a stethoscope. Not for something specific, but for something wrong. His two mechanics, Brody and Tanner, had stopped trying to understand his methods long ago. They arrived, they worked, they did what he told them, and the results were always correct. That was the arrangement, and it had functioned without complication for the better part of 6 years. The shop itself was immaculate in the particular way that only a man with deep internal standards could maintain it. Tools arranged on the wall by a logic no one else understood, diagnostic equipment beside handwritten logs in a spiral notebook no one was permitted to touch, and in the back corner of the office a small metal filing cabinet with a locked bottom drawer that had no label and was never discussed. At 8:43 the office phone rang. The caller from Meridian Concierge, a firm that placed specialized vehicles with specialized shops along the Front Range, explained the situation in the careful, measured tone of someone aware that how a request is framed determines whether it will be accepted. A client had a vehicle requiring immediate attention, not routine attention, the kind of attention that required someone who could work without oversight, keep a confidence, and understand a machine that most garages in the country had never seen in person. She had already called 4 other shops and none had agreed to take it. Elijah asked what the vehicle was, and after a brief pause she said the name Apex Spectre X. He was quiet for exactly 1 breath, then he said, "Bring it here," set the phone on the desk, and went back to the Porsche. At 8:51 the phone rang a second time, and the screen read Connor, and the conversation that followed lasted 2 minutes and 12 seconds and covered exactly one subject, whether Elijah would be home in time for dinner. He said yes, because Connor had something from school he wanted to show him. He meant it in the way he always meant things, not loosely, not as the tired optimism of a man who hopes the day cooperates, but as a decision that had already been made about what mattered and what didn't. The transport arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon, 2 black SUVs moving in practiced formation ahead of a low-profile trailer that sat close to the ground and carried its cargo under a fitted white cover that concealed everything. The woman who stepped out first from the lead vehicle was not a driver, not a coordinator, and not the kind of person who waited for anyone to open a door for her. Alexandra Holt was 44 years old and wore that fact the way certain people wear everything, as something selected rather than accumulated. Midnight blue jacket, tailored trousers, hair pulled back without a strand out of place, and Lucas Briggs 2 steps behind with a tablet already open in his hands, his eyes moving across the screen with the focus of someone who has been briefed 3 times and is internally running a 4th. Alexandra scanned the exterior of Monroe Custom Works for approximately 4 seconds. She said nothing, but the expression she produced said everything that her professional training kept her from saying aloud. This was not where a $20 million automobile belonged, and she was here because there was nowhere else left in Denver, and that fact was going to stay unspoken. When the transport team removed the cover, the Apex Spectre X emerged into the Colorado afternoon light, the color of pale platinum, not quite silver and not quite white, its surfaces catching the sun at angles that produced a low luminescence rather than a glare, its body long and narrow at the nose and curving into a rear section that seemed simultaneously to taper and widen depending on where you stood. Brody stopped mid-reach for a wrench. Tanner stood motionless for a moment before catching himself. Elijah Monroe crossed the lot at a measured pace, wiping his hands on a cloth, and when his eyes found the car, something changed in his face that lasted less than a second and then disappeared completely. Alexandra was watching, and she did not notice it. What she did notice, and what she could not quite account for, was the way he moved around the car. Not with the deliberate caution of a technician approaching unfamiliar hardware, and not with the over-correct confidence of someone performing competence for an audience. He moved the way a person moves around something they already know, the way a surgeon's hands know the instrument tray without looking at it, and that observation produced in Alexandra Holt a sensation she rarely experienced and did not enjoy: uncertainty. She filed it without resolving it and chose instead to focus on the assessment she expected him to give. She presented the problem in the efficient brevity of a woman who did not waste time. An abnormal vibration present above 2,800 RPM and most pronounced around 3,200, no identifiable cause found by 3 previous garages, no proposed solution she had been willing to accept. Elijah listened without interrupting, then walked to the car and pressed one hand to the hood at 3 separate points in deliberate sequence, tilted his head, crouched at the front fascia, held that position for nearly 15 seconds and stood. "Leave it overnight," he said. "I need to hear the engine cold." Alexandra looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to be patient or impatient, and then she asked what his experience was with this specific model. He looked back at her without blinking. Enough to fix it. He turned and walked back into the shop, and the conversation was over. She returned the next morning with Lucas and an expectation. Elijah had worked until 2 in the morning. On the work table lay a large sheet of drafting paper covered in hand-drawn diagrams, pressure lines, thermal pathways, a cross-section of the manifold system rendered in a hand that was precise and fast and clearly belonged to someone who had been doing this kind of technical illustration for a long time. He set it flat on the table and spoke without apology or qualification. The issue was not the engine, it was the cooling system, specifically the pressure distribution inside the dual-path thermal manifold. A component in the secondary heat channel had been replaced at some point, before the car reached him with a part that did not match the original specification, and the resulting deviation shifted the airflow pressure balance in the range between 2,500 and 3,500 RPM, which was where the vibration originated. Lucas studied the diagram in silence. Alexandra studied it too, and she could recognize, because she had spent 20 years in an industry built on precision, the difference between a document produced for show and one produced by someone who understood what they were looking at. That recognition produced not comfort but a sharpened suspicion, and Lucas had already pulled up the public record for Monroe Custom Works on his tablet. No hypercar manufacturer certifications, no major press, no industry awards, a repair shop with a faded sign and reliable reviews from clients who brought in standard performance vehicles. "I want an independent assessment," Alexandra said. She looked at Elijah steadily. "And what exactly is your background with this car specifically?" He folded the diagram once and set it down. "I've worked on the system involved." "That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving." Then the silence arrived, the kind that happens when 2 people are both deciding the same thing at the same moment, and Alexandra Holt decided. She looked at Elijah Monroe, at the work shirt, at the grease mark on his cuff, at the garage around him, and she committed to the position the way authority sometimes commits to a position when backing down feels more costly than being wrong. In front of Brody, in front of Tanner, in front of Lucas Briggs and his tablet, she said, "You could never build a supercar, and honestly, I'm not sure you're qualified to touch this one." Nobody moved in that garage for 3 full seconds. Brody found something to look at on the floor. Tanner turned toward the far workbench. Elijah Monroe looked at Alexandra Holt for exactly the length of time it takes to decide that a thing is not worth explaining. And the expression on his face was not contempt, not damage, not the flat indifference of a man who doesn't care. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has been misread so many times that the experience has become simply a feature of the landscape. "Do you want the car fixed?" he said, "or do you want to keep talking?" She walked out. Lucas stayed, and Elijah turned back to the work. That night, after Lucas had taken his dinner break and returned to the corner chair with a coffee he barely touched, Elijah worked alone under the single-focused lamp above the Spectre X, and his mind went back in the way it sometimes did when there was nothing external to hold it in place. He had been 28 when the project began, his title badge reading Chief Design Architect, his name on every drawing reduced to 2 letters, EM. By a board decision that required the lead designer's identity to remain confidential, a standard arrangement in the industry to which he had agreed without objection. 4 years of work, hundreds of sheets of drafting paper, a design philosophy he had defended through every marketing meeting and every revision proposal with the calm persistence of someone who did not care about attention but cared very much about getting things right. Perfect function with the absolute minimum of display. The dual-path thermal manifold was his invention, an approach to thermal management across the drivetrain that allowed the engine to operate at its theoretical maximum without the degradation that afflicted comparable machines at sustained high revolutions, patented under the company's name with an internal notation that read Inventor EM. 3 cars were built, each requiring nearly 8 months of assembly. The first went to a collector in Dubai, the second to a private buyer in Switzerland. The third, the one on his lift in Colorado, had passed through 2 prior owners before reaching Alexandra Holt, who had paid $14 million for it at a private New York auction and considered it the centerpiece of everything she had built. The cars were unveiled in the spring of 2015, and the press called EM the most quietly brilliant anonymous mind in 21st-century automotive design, and nobody knew who that was, and that was the week Rachel died. She had been driving home from a night shift at the hospital when the accident happened, and Connor had been 22 months old, and the week that was the highest point in Elijah's professional life was also the last week of his marriage. He resigned quietly. The board pushed back hard because they could not understand why the person who had just designed the most celebrated car of the decade would walk away from it, and he did not explain. The meetings lasted 3 weeks and produced nothing except a growing awareness on the board's part that there was no argument they could make that would hold. What do you say to a man who has already decided what matters? You sign the paper. He negotiated 1 term. He surrendered his financial interest in the company's future revenue from the Spectre X, and in exchange every document connecting EM to Elijah Monroe was sealed permanently and without exception. They signed because they needed him to go quietly, and he had given them what they needed. He opened a shop in Denver because he needed work he could leave at 8 o'clock, and because Connor needed someone at the dinner table, and because the kind of life that had produced the Apex Spectre X had also produced a boy who had lost his mother at 22 months, and the boy was more important. Now standing in front of the DPTM with his hands on the manifold casing, he found the problem in 7 minutes. The secondary regulation valve was a near-match replacement that someone had installed without understanding that the DPTM's tolerances did not accommodate near-match anything. 3 millimeters in internal diameter. 3 millimeters that created a pressure imbalance every time the engine climbed above 2,800 revolutions per minute. Only someone who had the original design specifications would know to look for it, and only someone who had written those specifications would recognize it immediately by touch. Elijah retrieved a legal pad from the office and began writing out the corrective procedure from memory. On the 3rd morning, Alexandra arrived with someone new. Marcus Webb carried a leather portfolio and the settled authority of a man whose credentials were the first thing he communicated about himself, and he had come with 8 years of experience at a European hypercar manufacturer and a consulting practice built on the kind of assessments that wealthy clients paid substantial rates to receive. He spent 45 minutes with the car, reviewed Elijah's diagnostic notes with the expression of a man looking for what he expected to find rather than what was actually there, asked 2 technical questions that Elijah answered directly, and produced a conclusion. The throttle body assembly required replacement. A specialist part from a supplier in Munich at $85,000 plus labor, and he presented this with the tone of a man delivering a confident solution to a problem he fully understood. Elijah waited until he finished, then set his corrective procedure on the table beside Webb's portfolio, 4 handwritten pages with 2 additional pages of pressure diagrams, and said plainly, "The throttle body isn't the cause. If you replace it, the vibration will remain. You will have spent the money and the time and still have the same problem." Marcus Webb looked at the document, looked at the man who had produced it, and said that the analysis did not follow any published diagnostic protocol for this vehicle class and had no basis in publicly available technical documentation, which was not wrong, because the specifications for the DPTM had never been released outside Apex Dynamics' internal archive. Lucas Briggs looked at the pressure diagrams for a long time without speaking. Alexandra looked from Marcus Webb to Elijah Monroe, and the choice she was making was not actually about the car, and some part of her understood that. She chose Marcus Webb because he had a portfolio and a contact in Munich and the entire vocabulary of established authority, and the man across from her had none of those signals, only 4 pages in a handwritten hand and a certainty she could not explain. Elijah picked up his document, folded it, and said one sentence before walking back into the shop. "When the vibration is still there after the throttle body comes out, you know where I am." Lucas Briggs did not follow Alexandra to the parking lot immediately. He stood in the bay for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the table where the document had been, thinking about something he had not yet formed into a question. 3 days later, the Spectre X came back to Alexandra's building with a new throttle body and a signed assessment from Marcus Webb confirming acceptable performance parameters. Documentation produced on the second day after installation, before the vehicle had been run at sustained RPM long enough to confirm anything. The vibration was unchanged at 2,800 revolutions. By 3,200 there was an additional symptom, a slight hesitation in throttle response that had not existed before. The replacement had not solved the original problem. It had introduced a second one. Alexandra had 5 days until the Holt Prestige Motors annual showcase. 200 invited guests, 6 automotive journalists, a ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, a raised platform under its own lighting array, and at the center of it the Apex Spectre X scheduled for a live engine start and a sustained rev sequence that the invitations described as a moment guests would not forget. Lucas Briggs drove to Monroe Custom Works the following morning without telling Alexandra, parked in the lot, walked into the front bay, and asked Elijah directly how serious the manifold problem was. Elijah answered the same way he answered everything. If the car ran a sustained sequence above 2,800 RPM, the incorrect valve would generate concentrated heat in a localized section of the DPTM that the system was not designed to manage, not catastrophic failure immediately, but progressive thermal stress in a component that, because it was not publicly documented, would take months to source and additional weeks to replace, and all of it would happen in public, in front of 200 people. Lucas asked how he could possibly know the DPTM specifications well enough to predict the failure point, and Elijah said he read a lot. Lucas clearly did not believe this, and clearly was not ready to push further. He went back and presented the concern to Alexandra as precisely as he could. It was not enough. She declined to change the program. That afternoon, Elijah sat at his desk and wrote a letter on plain paper addressed to the office of Alexandra Holt. 4 paragraphs, clinical, no personal reference, the symptom progression described point by point, the component at risk identified specifically, and a recommendation that the live engine demonstration be removed from or significantly shortened in the event program. He signed it Elijah Monroe, Monroe Custom Works, sealed it, and put it in the mail. It was delivered the following morning. Nobody replied. Dr. Nolan Vance had been in Denver for 4 days attending a symposium at the University of Colorado's engineering department when he heard the name of the garage through a colleague who worked adjacent to the concierge automotive sector. The car had been to multiple shops. The problem was unresolved. The garage was called Monroe Custom Works. Nolan set down his coffee and went there that afternoon. When Elijah looked up from the Porsche and saw who was in the doorway, he set his wrench on the frame without being called and came over, because there was no pretending that was a routine customer. They had not seen each other in 10 years, and there was no moment of not recognizing each other. There was instead the particular quiet of 2 people who share a large unresolved history and are deciding in a few seconds how to enter it. They went into the office. Nolan said, "You're repairing the car you built." Elijah said, "I'm repairing a client's car." Nolan said, "That's the same thing." Nolan then said that Apex Dynamics wanted to intervene, contact Alexandra through official channels, send a factory technician from Detroit, resolve the problem cleanly. Elijah said no. Nolan leaned forward. He explained that this was not about Elijah and not about what had happened 10 years ago and not about the non-disclosure or the resignation or any of it. It was about the car, one of 3. If it suffered serious thermal damage during a public event, in front of journalists, because a valve had been swapped and nobody had caught it, that story would leave Denver and it would become the story about the Spectre X. And every collector who owned one would begin to worry, and the car's legacy would be rewritten by a failure that was entirely preventable. He waited. Elijah was quiet for a while, looking through the office window at the empty center bay where the Spectre X had been sitting. The argument Nolan had made was not a new kind of argument. Elijah had heard variations of it before, from the board, from engineers he respected, from people who believed that certain work was too important to be left alone regardless of the personal cost. What was different this time was that the argument was not about his career or his legacy or his professional obligation to the industry. It was about the machine itself. One specific machine, with a specific flaw, in the hands of someone who did not know what she was holding and was about to display that fact to everyone in the room. Elijah understood in that quiet that he had not stayed out of the situation because he was indifferent to it. He had stayed out because no one had given him a reason to enter that was worth the cost of entering. Nolan had just given him one. Then he said, "I'll be at the event." Nolan asked what he planned to do. Elijah said it would depend on what happened. Nolan asked one more question. If she asked who he was, what would he say? Elijah was quiet again, longer this time. "I'm a mechanic from Denver." Nolan looked at him with the expression of a man who has learned that some decisions belong entirely to the person making them, nodded once, said he would also be present, and walked out of the shop. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Denver was the kind of room that made everything inside it feel deliberate. The ceiling was high enough that sound traveled differently, the lighting was warm and precisely angled, and 200 guests in evening dress moved through the space with the unhurried confidence of people accustomed to exactly this kind of room. At the center, on a raised platform built specifically for the evening, the Apex Spectre X sat under a column of focused white light that gave the car's platinum surface a presence it already possessed without any enhancement. Guests slowed when they passed it. Several stopped entirely, standing at the velvet rope with drinks in hand, saying things to each other that the room's ambient noise absorbed. Alexandra moved through the event in a midnight blue evening dress with the practiced ease of someone who had hosted enough gatherings of this kind that the hosting had become instinctive, reading each cluster of guests, asking the right question, moving on at the right moment. Lucas Briggs managed the operational layer from a careful distance. The program was on schedule. Everything was as designed. Elijah Monroe entered through the service entrance at 8:12 in a pressed white shirt and dark trousers, was stopped by security, and was let through by a gesture from Lucas Briggs, who had been watching the entrance camera and had made a decision 2 days ago that he had not shared with his employer. Elijah positioned himself near the edge of the platform, close enough to the car that he could reach it in under 15 seconds, and stood with one hand in his pocket, watching the room the way a person watches something they are responsible for, even when they hold no official standing in the situation. The program director took the stage at 8:45, introduced the centerpiece of the evening, and a technician climbed into the Spectre X and brought the engine to life. The sound that filled the room was low and broad and seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than the machine itself, and several guests set down their glasses, and the rev sequence began climbing past 2,000 RPM with the controlled authority of a properly operating machine. At 40 seconds, the vibration arrived. It came first as a tremor in the platform structure that guests near the rope felt in their feet before their ears confirmed it, and then as a roughness threading through the engine note, a texture that did not belong to this machine. The thermal indicator on the monitoring tablet began climbing in a steady, purposeful arc. The technician looked at the screen. Marcus Webb, standing near the rear axis of the platform, turned pale. Elijah was already moving. He walked at the pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and does not need to hurry because they are already thinking past the act of arriving. He stepped past the velvet rope. A guard moved to intercept. Lucas Briggs raised one hand from across the room. The guard stopped. The room was getting quiet in the specific way. Rooms get quiet when something real is happening inside them, and 200 people were watching a man in a white dress shirt open the hood of a $20 million car in a hotel ballroom. His hands moved with the certainty of a man who had designed every component he was touching, who knew not just how the system functioned but why each element existed, what problem it had been built to solve, what it would do when pushed beyond a corrected tolerance. 4 adjustments, a pressure check by hand at 2 points, a 5th adjustment. 90 seconds. The vibrations stopped. The thermal indicator stabilized. The engine sound returned to what it was supposed to be, smooth, deep, composed, the sound of something that had been built to be precisely this and nothing more. And in the ballroom the silence lasted a moment that seemed longer than it was, and then the low murmur of 200 people arriving at the same understanding moved through the room. Elijah lowered the hood with both hands, holding the last inch of movement until the latch engaged softly. He stood. He did not look at the room. He looked at the car, at the line of the roof, at the shoulder curving from the windshield pillar down to the rear quarter, at the way the light caught the front splitter's edge. He had drawn that splitter on a Sunday afternoon in 2012 with a cup of cold coffee on the desk and the first DPTM diagram taped to the wall behind him. He had not thought about that afternoon in a very long time. From the rear of the room, Dr. Nolan Vance walked forward through the parted crowd at the measured pace of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has arrived at it. He stopped in the center of the space between Elijah and Alexandra, and he said, in a voice clear enough that the room received it without him raising his volume, "I'm Dr. Nolan Vance, Chief Engineer of Apex Dynamics. The man who just saved this car, and who designed every single component of it from the first sketch to the last assembly drawing, is Elijah Monroe. He worked under the initials EM. He was the chief design architect of the Apex Spectre techs." The room produced a sound that was not applause and was not conversation but the particular layered murmur of 200 people absorbing the same fact from the same position at the same moment. Camera phones appeared. A journalist near the edge of the platform raised her hand with the instinct of someone whose profession had just given her a gift she had not anticipated. Another guest near the back said something to the person beside them, and the observation spread outward in a low wave. The EM drawings, which had circulated in collector circles as a kind of mythological object, signed works from an unidentified genius that had never been publicly attributed, had a name now, and the name was attached to a man in a white shirt standing next to the car he had designed, with no expression of triumph on his face and none of satisfaction either, only the composed stillness of someone who has done what needed to be done and is now waiting for the room to catch up. Marcus Webb was no longer visible anywhere in the ballroom. Alexandra Holt stood 12 feet away from Elijah Monroe and looked at him with the expression of a person whose understanding of a situation had just been reconstructed entirely and who was finding the new version more difficult to hold because the old one had been comfortable. They found a room off the corridor behind the catering area. Fluorescent lighting, a plain table, nothing like the ballroom they had just come from, and the four of them sat: Alexandra, Elijah, Lucas Briggs, and Nolan Vance. Nolan set a folder on the table containing photographs of original design drawings signed EM, a section of board minutes from Apex Dynamics' 2015 spring meeting, and the internal patent file for the dual-path thermal manifold with an inventor's designation line that read EM. Alexandra turned through the pages one at a time, and her hands were not entirely steady. When she looked up, she asked the only question she could form into words: "Why didn't you say who you were?" Elijah said, "You didn't ask." The sentence was short enough that arguing with it was impossible and accurate enough that arguing would have been beside the point, because she had not asked. She had looked and assessed and spoken, and the step that was the question she had never posed. A long silence followed, the kind she did not attempt to fill. She looked through the room's small window at the corridor where the muffled sound of the event continuing without her drifted in faintly, and then she asked in a voice that was quieter and more deliberate than the one she had used in his garage. "What was the design philosophy for the car?" Elijah said. "Perfect function, no unnecessary display." She sat with that for a moment. She had spent 20 years building a business around things that were displayed: cars in showrooms, brands on invitations, names in press releases, status communicated through every surface and signal available. And the man across from her had spent 4 years building something that expressed its nature entirely through what it did rather than what it announced, had then sealed his name away from it completely, and was now sitting in a plain room under fluorescent lights, while the thing he had built was 50 feet away under a spotlight he had never requested and did not appear to need. She thought about the first day at the garage. She thought about the diagram on the table, and the way Lucas had gone quiet looking at it, and the way she had looked past both of those things because the evidence in front of her had not matched the story she had already written. That was, she understood now, the most expensive mistake she had made in recent memory. Not because of the car, not because of the event, but because of the category of error it represented. She had not looked. She had assumed. And the distance between those two things was where the truth had been waiting the whole time. Nolan made the offer: a consulting role on Apex Dynamics' next confidential project, full creative authority, a compensation figure that was several orders of magnitude above what Monroe Custom Works generated in a year. Elijah said with the same flatness he used to say most things, "Thank you, no." Lucas Briggs, who had not spoken since entering the room, said to no one specifically, "I knew the pressure diagrams were different from anything I'd seen before. I couldn't understand how someone drew them from memory. Now I understand." He said it without agenda, as a simple fact offered to the room. Elijah looked at him and nodded once. There was no formal apology in that room, and Elijah had not come for one. He had come because a machine he had built was about to be damaged in public, and the damage was preventable, and preventing it was correct regardless of who was watching or what anyone said afterward. He pushed back his chair and stood and picked up his jacket and said to Nolan, "Take care of the other two," Nolan said he always did. Elijah walked to the door and left without looking back. Monroe Custom Works opened at 7 the following morning, and the Porsche 911 GT3 was still on the lift where it had been waiting since the beginning of the week, and Elijah pulled on his work shirt and picked up his mechanical pencil and went back to work. Brody arrived at 7:15. Tanner at 7:22. Neither of them mentioned the previous evening, and Elijah did not raise it because the arrangement had always been that the work was the point and the work was what continued. The phone began ringing at 7:30 and by 9 it had rung 11 times. Concierge services he'd never worked with, collector clients from other cities, a journalist from an automotive publication, a law firm representing a private equity group he'd never heard of. And he answered none of them, because there was a Porsche on the lift that had been waiting patiently and deserved to be finished. At 9:12, Diana Kerr arrived, Director of Communications for Apex Dynamics, professional and composed, carrying a business card and a formal acquisition offer in a document she set on the table with the confidence of someone presenting a conclusion that no reasonable person would decline. A buyout of Monroe Custom Works, a return to Detroit in a design leadership role, full creative authority on the company's next major project, and a compensation package described as significant, which was an understatement visible even through the careful language. Elijah read it completely. Then he set it down and picked up his pencil and said, "Tell them I appreciate it. The answer is no." Diana Kerr stood in the doorway for a moment, slightly longer than the one typically granted to a conclusion. He thanked him, collected her card, and walked back through the shop to the parking lot. At 10:32, a dark sedan pulled into the lot, not the black SUV, not anything that announced itself, and Alexandra Holt walked in alone and set an envelope on the workbench beside his pencil. Inside was a check covering the full amount of the initial diagnostic work she had walked away from without paying when she had taken the car to Marcus Webb. She looked at Elijah and said, "I didn't know who I was talking to." He looked at the envelope, then at her and said, "Now you do." He picked up the envelope, opened the drawer beside him and placed it inside, not as a performance of indifference, not as dismissal, but as a man who had been owed something and had received it and was ready to continue. Alexandra did not leave immediately. She stood in the shop and looked around it, at the tools on the wall, at the drafting paper folded on the workbench, at the work lamp over the lift, at the Porsche waiting on the platform, and she had no word for what she was looking at in that room, which was its own kind of answer. Then she walked to the door and went out, and the sound of her footsteps across the lot was the last sound that came from that direction all day. That evening, after Brody and Tanner had gone home and the main bay lights were off, Elijah sat alone in the office and unlocked the bottom drawer of the metal filing cabinet. Inside was a folder of drafting paper that had yellowed at the margins over 10 years, and beneath it a lanyard badge inside a plastic sleeve. The badge read Apex Dynamics at the top, and below the logo, in the same clean typeface used on every official document the company had ever produced, it said, "Elijah Monroe, Chief Design Architect." He held it in the quiet of the shop and looked at his name on it for a while. Not EM. Not a set of initials chosen by a board that wanted the work without the person. His name. The full name of the man who had spent 4 years designing a machine that 3 people in the world owned, and who had then walked away from everything that came with it, because there was a boy at home who needed someone at the table. He thought about the DPTM, the hours in the lab testing pressure tolerances, the late nights filling pages with thermal calculations, the argument he had won with the engineering team about the manifold's secondary channel, the specific shape of the debate and how much it had mattered to him at the time. He thought about the 3mm valve that had caused all of this, how small that deviation was against the full scope of the original design, and how it had taken someone with complete knowledge of that design to find it in 7 minutes. The work had spoken for itself. It always had. That was, he supposed, what he had been trying to build toward from the beginning. Not recognition, but something that stood on its own without requiring its author to stand beside it. He sat with the badge in his hands for a long time. Then he set it back inside the plastic sleeve, placed the drafting folder on top of it, and closed the drawer, not because the name embarrassed him, not because the chapter needed to be hidden, but because it was complete. Everything about that period of his life that needed to be said had now been said, in a hotel ballroom in front of 200 people, in a service corridor under fluorescent light, and in this office by the simple fact of what his hands had done in 90 seconds. The drawer closed. He turned off the office light. He looked at the time, checked that the bay was secure, and walked to his car. He had 17 minutes to get home. Connor would be setting the table. Monroe Custom Works would open at 7 the next morning, the way it always did, the way it would continue to, because the work was the point. The quiet, precise daily work of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had never needed anyone else to know it too.